Good morning. It's good to see you here this morning. We do have a good crowd. It's good to see everybody out. The rain that we had this morning, such a blessing from God that's kind of unusual for this time of year. And I think it's supposed to be high of 88 degrees today. And how unusual is that? What a blessing it is to have that kind of weather in order to come out and worship the Lord on the first day of the weekend in July. This morning, we are going to continue our series on breaking down barriers. That is our theme for the year. We are breaking down barriers to good relationships. It was actually, I guess, April. It's the last time I preached a sermon on breaking down barriers. I got into another series on authority after that, and so we kind of neglected our theme, but we'll get back to that this morning. And this morning we're going to talk about breaking down the barrier of time. When I talk about breaking down the barrier of time, I'm talking about breaking down the barrier of our feeling that we don't have enough time, and maybe a misuse of our time. How often have we either said ourselves or someone has said to us, "I just don't have time for that." Time oftentimes becomes a barrier to us, and the things that we want to do, or perhaps even sometimes the things that we understand that we need to be doing. I would do it, I see the importance of it, but I just don't have time for it. Well, the amazing thing about that is that everyone has the same amount of time in a day. You ever seen someone who just seemed to get so many things done? I have preaching friends, and Jeremy really would be one of these, who they get so much stuff done in a day. I have friends that I wonder how in the world do they get so many things done, have so many irons in the fire, and yet they still have the time to work their sermons up and all those kinds of things. And I wonder, how in the world do they do that? Well, the fact of the matter is that I have 24 hours in my day. They have 24 hours in their day. And here's the secret of that. They make time for the things that are important to them. They budget their time for those things. And that's really a lesson that I think we all can learn, is that what is important to us ought to be the things that we prioritize as far as the spending of our time. If I see something that someone else is doing and they seem to have time for it, even though it seems like they have a life that is much more hectic than mine, and yet I see that they're able to do this, I need to ask myself, if I see that it is important for them to be doing that, is it important for me as well? And if it's important for me, then maybe I need to make that a greater priority in my life. And that way, perhaps I will have the time to do it. But even more than that, we must make time for the things that are important to God. In Matthew chapter 22, verses 36 through 40, a lawyer comes to Jesus, a scribe of that day, comes to Jesus. He wants to know, what are the great commandments? What is the great commandment in the law? He's talking about the Old Testament system, but the same two commands that are foundational to the Old Testament system are also foundational to the New Testament system as well. And Jesus tells him the most important commandment is, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. That's with everything that you have. He says that's how deeply you love God. That's important to God, that you love Him with everything that you have and with everything that you are. And He says the second command is like to it, and that is, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And what Jesus is expressing there is the things that are important to God. You want to know at the end of the day, what are the things that are important to God? Your relationship with Him and your relationship with others. Those are the two things that are most important to God. And so those things ought to be what are most important to us. And so I would ask you as we begin this sermon this morning, what is it that is most important to you? And I'm going to suggest to you that what is most important to you is the thing that you're going to spend your time on. And so we need to be wise about our time, and that's where we're going to spend the most of our time this morning, is talking about those things that we can do to be sure that we are being wise with the time that God has given us. A lot of Scripture about time, just as there are a lot of songs about time. And I appreciate those songs that were led this morning because they emphasize the importance of relationship with God, relationship with one another, how important those things are to us, and how we need to be wise about how we conduct ourselves so that what is important to God becomes important to us. The first thing I would suggest to you that the Bible teaches us is that being wise about our time means recognizing that our time is limited. In Ephesians chapter 5, let's go over there and read that passage. Ephesians chapter 5, we're going to begin at verse 15. Ephesians chapter 5, beginning at verse 15, says, "See then that you walk circumspectly." Circumspectly means to have a vision of what is around you, to see what is important, what isn't important, what is safe, what is dangerous, those kinds of things. Being aware of the circumstances in which you live and the surrounding of your life. That's what it means to walk circumspectly. And Paul tells the Ephesians that's the way you need to be walking your life. Not kind of whistling through the graveyard kind of a life, but being aware of things and how you need to conduct yourself. Not as fools, but as wise. He says you need to walk with wisdom. And then he adds in verse 16, redeeming the time, because the days are evil. The idea of the days are evil means, and this was true then, it's true now, it's been true really of every generation of people. Evil has a stranglehold on this world. In the day that Paul wrote this, the days were evil. They were characterized by evil. And the same is true for us today. And we need to recognize that, and we need to distance ourselves from the evil days in which we live. And what he says there in that passage is that we combat that evil by filling our lives with good things. In verse 16 he says, redeeming the time. To redeem something is to pay for it, to buy that thing. We're buying the time that we have. The word time in this passage is not the typical Greek word that we think of as time, the chronos, the clock time, day, hour, minute, that kind of thing. That's not the word that he's using here. He's using the word kairos, which means seasonal time. And what he says is, we live in a season where good is limited, and where doing good, therefore, is limited. We need to recognize the limit of the season of life that we have. There are only so many days, only so many weeks, only so many months and years that we have to accomplish what we need to do in order to be good in a world that is evil. He says you redeem it. What does he mean, redeem it? Well, in I guess its most literal sense, it means to buy back something. But I would suggest to you that in terms that we normally think of buying something back, you really can't buy time back. When you use your time, the next minute that we will spend together, when that minute is over, that minute is gone. And we can't get that minute back. Even if we had all the money in the world, we couldn't buy that minute back. And so when he says redeeming the time, he's not talking about buying back time that is impossible to do. He is talking about buying forward the time. We all can do that. We can determine that the time that we are going to spend from here on out is going to be time that is filled with good things, with those good things that contrast to the evil day in which we live. Your translation may say, if you have one of the later translations, making the most of your time. And that's what our job is, as far as time is concerned, to make the most of the time that we have left on this earth. Psalm chapter 90 and verse 12, very important thing that the psalmist says there, teach us to number our days. And he says when we learn to number our days, we realize then how frail our lives are, in the sense of how fleeting, how passing our time is, and how precious that time is. We can only understand the preciousness of time as we understand that our time is not unlimited, that we don't have all the time in the world. And so we need to recognize that time is limited, and then we need to determine that we're going to avoid time wasters. Go over to 1 Peter chapter 4. That's the point that Paul makes, or that Peter makes in 1 Peter chapter 4, beginning in verse 1. It's all about time in these 4 verses. He says, therefore, since Christ suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same mind. For he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. He's talking about making a change in your lives. Now, Peter is writing here not to the world, although the world needs to recognize that they spend enough time in the world. But he's writing, I think, primarily to Christians here. And he says you need to take stock of the life that you are living. When you became a Christian, did you really commit yourself to being everything that Jesus Christ wants you to be, to being like Him? Was that the first and foremost thing on your mind, that now, because I am a Christian, I'm a disciple of Jesus Christ, I'm going to live my life like He did? That's what he's talking about there in verse 1. He says when we do that, verse 2, that person who says, I'm going to commit myself better to living like Jesus lived, to sacrificing myself like Jesus sacrificed Himself. He says that he should no longer should live the rest of his life in the flesh for the lust of men, but for the will of God. Do you see time there? He says when we make that decision that we're going to live like Christ and not like the world, it's going to influence how we use our time. We're going to make the determination to not live our time in the wastefulness of life. We're going to spend our time in doing those things that are good. And note in verse 3, I love the way that he presents this. We have spent enough of our past lifetime in doing the will of the Gentiles. He says if you've not yet committed yourself to service to Jesus Christ, to living like Christ as you ought to, if your life is not consumed with being like Christ, instead you're doing those other things that are out in the world, he says, what you've done is you spent enough time doing that. You need to quit doing those things. Things like what? Well, these wasteful things. He says you spent enough of the past lifetime in doing the will of the Gentiles when we walked in lewdness, lust, drunkenness, revelries, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries. What he's saying is you did enough of that kind of stuff when Jesus wasn't your Savior? You engaged in all those kind of activities when you had not committed yourself to being like Jesus Christ. You need to end that. You need to not get back into those kinds of things. You need to put those things behind you because you have wasted enough of your life in doing those things. In regard to these, they think it's strange that you do not run with them in the same flood of dissipation. There's your idea of wastefulness. And what he says is when you make that decision, when you decide that I've had enough of this world, I've had enough of doing the things that the world does, and I'm going to recommit myself to being what Jesus Christ wants me to be, to living like Him. Don't expect the world to throw you a ticker tape parade because they're not going to. They're not going to celebrate the decision that you have made. Instead, they're going to say all kinds of things about you that are not very flattering at all. Isn't that interesting? That you can live your life in what he calls here dissipation, wastefulness, prodigal living, the prodigal, the parable of the prodigal son in Luke chapter 15. That word prodigal in that passage is the same word here that is dissipation. He was a dissipating son, and that means he was a wasteful son. He wasted his life in riotous, ungodly living. And he says, when you make the determination that you're not going to do that anymore, that you're going to wholly commit yourself to Jesus Christ, don't expect your old buddies to understand. Don't expect your girlfriends to understand, because they're not. They're not going to understand why you aren't wasting your life, your time, like they are wasting their time in all of this sinful kind of conduct. He says we spent enough time in doing those things. And I want to suggest to you that in this regard, we need to think more about how we spend our time than just, well, we're not going to do sinful things. We're not going to live with lustful things and what he calls the drinking parties and all of those kinds of things that people in the world oftentimes give themselves to. He says we are going to avoid that kind of conduct. I really think we need to think broader than that, not just avoiding sinful conduct of any type in any time in our lives from here on out, but we're going to avoid giving unproductive conduct too much of our time. If we're not careful, we can so focus on not giving our lives to the sinful things of this world that we neglect the idea of not giving ourselves over to the unproductive things of this world. In Ecclesiastes chapter 10 and verse 18, the wise man talks about the lazy person and what happens in the lazy person's house and life. He says, because of laziness, the building decays, and through idleness of hands, the house leaks. It's his encouragement not to give yourself over to just this idea of doing nothing. If you do nothing with your life is going to decay. Your life it's going to be a life that eventually falls. All because you don't do anything with it. You ever seen these buildings that maybe a restaurant that it goes out of business and the building's just sitting there and they've taken the signs off and it's empty and it stays empty for a little while. Ever noticed how quickly those buildings deteriorate? It's amazing to me. I mean, in a month, you can look at a building that no longer is housing any activity at all, and you can recognize that it's not because of the way the building looks. Well, he says that's the way that life is. If you give your life to inactivity, then your life is going to look like the building that is not occupied. In 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 13, there's an interesting thing that Paul says there when he's talking about the support of widows, and he says they need to be older women, but he wants the younger widows in verse 11 to get married. And he notes in verse 13 about younger widows and the opportunity they have to have too much idle time on their hands. Listen to what he says. And besides, they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, and not only idle, but also gossips and busybodies, saying things which they ought not. Now, that's not just an older or a younger widow's problem. That can be a younger widower's problem as well. That can be anybody's problem. We can all fall into that kind of a situation. You know, I was reading that this morning, and I wondered, how would Paul have written that today? If Paul was writing that in 2024, what would that passage have said? Maybe it would have said, they'll spend too much time on Facebook. Or if they're younger, on TikTok, that kind of thing. I would ask these guys over here, but they'd say something I've never even heard of that people are engaged in. I think he would say here, we'd include in that, you need to watch your time on the computer and this interacting of things, and their day and time, Facebook and TikTok and all these other things, that was a house-to-house thing. You go to somebody's house and you gossip to them. Well, I'll tell you, we can gossip, and we do gossip. We don't think as much about it because we can do it with a keyboard in the privacy of our home. Young people, don't put yourself in a dungeon, in a basement, in your room, and spend all of your time there doing things that are unproductive. Because if you do, the building of your life will decay. Your physical life will begin to leak, as it were. So avoid time wasters. And thirdly, we need to prepare for when time will be no more. In Colossians chapter 3 and verse 2, the Apostle Paul says, set your mind on things above, not on things on the earth. That's his way of saying to the Colossians, you need to be thinking about eternity. What's going to happen when this life is over? Where are you going to spend your eternity? As is oftentimes been said, heaven is a prepared place for prepared people. And that's what Paul is saying in this passage. You need to prepare yourself. Your mind needs to be running through those things that you need to be doing in your life that are preparing for you to spend eternity in heaven. Set your mind on things above, not on things of this earth. Now, he's not saying here you can't have any earthly interests. He's talking about priority here. That in all the things that you wrap yourself up with, be sure that at the top of the list, you are setting your mind on those things that are above. Jesus said it like this in Matthew 6:19 through 20, lay up for yourselves treasure in heaven, because moth and rust cannot destroy, thieves can't break in and steal that. Don't spend so much time on laying up these treasures in earth that are so vulnerable. Lay up treasure in heaven that is not vulnerable to the passing of time on this earth. In 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 19, Paul said it like this to Timothy and how he was to instruct those who are rich. And he didn't say you have to give away all your riches. What he said is, Timothy, those people in your association, in that church there in Ephesus who are rich, you need to be teaching them to be rich not only in the things that they have, but be rich in good works. And he says, when you're rich in good works, what you are doing, verse 19, is you are storing up for yourselves a good foundation for the time to come. That's the same idea as laying up treasure in heaven. Those good things that you do with your treasure on earth, he says, are put into your account as a treasure in heaven. In Luke 11, verses 16 through 21, Jesus tells the parable of the rich fool. The rich fool who has a good year in his agriculture. And so he has to figure out what he's going to do with those things. And he says, I know what I'll do. I'll tear down my old small barns and I'll build bigger barns. And I'll have somewhere to store all of this stuff that I have. And then I can not worry about anything. I can just eat and drink and be merry. That's how I can spend my life. And the answer comes ringing back in verse 21, fool, you're a fool. This night your soul will be required of you. See, this man thought he had all the time in the world. And the fact of the matter is, he only had a few precious hours left. He wasted the time that he had left. He had no interest in redeeming, in buying forward the time. And Jesus says there, so is he, that's any of us, who lays up treasure for himself, but is not rich toward God. It's a message for all of us, that we need to think not so much about the things of this earth as we think the things of heaven and preparing to go there. And so my encouragement to you this morning is don't allow time to be a barrier to building great relationships. Barbara Bush said a number of years ago, at the end of your life, you will never regret not having passed one more test, not winning one more verdict, or not closing one more deal. You will regret time not spent with a husband, a friend, a child, or a parent. And I would add to that, or with other Christians. You think you'll regret when you're coming to the end of your life that you spent too much time with Christians? I suspect you'll regret that you didn't spend enough. Or, most important, did you spend time with God? No one who comes to the end of their life will say, you know what? I just spent too much time with God. Realize that now, the importance of that now. And don't let all the other things that have the potential of filling your day cause you to neglect filling a good portion of your day, seeking the things that are above. and not the things that are on this earth. And that's our lesson for this morning. I hope that it'll be a benefit to you as you go out into this world tomorrow and you spend your 24 hours in the way that you do, that you'll realize that you have an obligation to spend some time considering heaven and where you're going to go when this life is over. You want to be a worker for the Lord? First of all, you need to be with the Lord. And we extend to you the invitation of Jesus Christ to come to Him for the salvation of your soul. Can we help you to do that this morning? Jesus said, "He who believes and is baptized will be saved." He hadn't said anything different in the last 2,000 years. Same thing that made a person a Christian 2,000 years ago, that resulted in the forgiveness of their sins and the hope of eternal life, will do that today as well. All we need is for you to let us know that we can help you to do that, or help you in any way as you are subject to the invitation of Jesus Christ. If you are, let us know how we can help you by coming forward right now while together we stand and sing.